Go ahead, Jim.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, welcome everybody, and thanks for attending. The future is already here, managing public records in a changing technological landscape. And I'll be presenting first, and Chris Stenson will be following me. But I'll be talking about a couple of issues that are going to affect pretty much any local government agency that wants to keep up with and make use of technological advancements. The first one is the use of personal mobile devices by employees of public agency. If you've got people who want to use their own phone, their own tablet, their own laptop, what are the challenges, what are the benefits, and what are the challenges you're going to run into, and what can you do? Informally, this is a course called Bring Your Own Device, or BYOD. The other thing I'll be talking about is the use of social media by government agencies, and that's pretty self-explanatory. I think everyone knows what that is, too. But each of these, BYOD and social media, has its own advantages as part of doing business as a local agency. Unfortunately, each also has some pretty significant drawbacks that need to be addressed. I'm going to bring up several points that you're going to need to remember when taking advantages of these technologies while doing public business. There we go. Okay, we'll start with the Bring Your Own Device, BYOD, letting your employees use whatever device they would like to use when working. There are several advantages to BYOD. It's supposed to increase productivity. When an employee can work from and use a device of his or her own choosing, it's supposed to be more enjoyable to them than being forced to use an agency-issued device, right? And that means happier staff, and happier staff is more productive staff. And further, by allowing the staff the opportunity to use a device that they're used to, more comfortable with, they can respond to requests faster. They're more productive. And that leads to a significant increase in productivity. Yeah. Also, in this scenario, employees are more likely to work outside the office, maybe at odd hours, and that's supposed to increase productivity as well. Second, BYOD is supposed to connect age groups. Of course, right, the stereotype is that members of the younger generation are more adept at using smartphones, tablets, and similar devices than your older employees are. Being one of these older employees, I haven't found this necessarily to be true, but what they say is by implementing BYOD culture, older employees are given the opportunity to be exposed to these devices and increase their productivity. Of course, the most obvious benefit to an agency of BYOD is that you don't have to purchase a significant number of costly devices. You save money, especially on IT spending, right? You're not purchasing all these devices, tablets, laptops, phones, etc., to enable employees to do their jobs. And clearly, you don't have to buy the devices. That may represent significant savings. Also, breakage and waste are likely to be reduced by the fact that people tend to take better care of their own hardware than they do of any company-owned devices. And repair costs are going to be the employee's burden at any rate. Another advantage is it may, and this is, in doing some research for this was a little new to me, but it may lower security risks if records are stored on the cloud. And at this point, common wisdom is that sound BYOD strategy does involve cloud storage. Then if a device becomes lost or unusable, the records themselves haven't been lost because they're stored elsewhere. And finally, another advantage to BYOD is it allows your staff to work anywhere using their own devices. Employees are more able to work outside the office, answering emails and completing other tasks. And when staff members have the means, they're more likely to work outside the office. Their responsiveness is going to be increased. And in a sector, in the public sector, which does not have the greatest reputation to begin with, unfortunately, any increase in productivity and increase in responsiveness can only help. So those are some advantages of BYOD culture. And unfortunately, Bring Your Own Device does represent or does come with some significant issues, significant problems. A main one is privacy. Even if you presume that government should be transparent, which it should, and public records should be open records, your agency still may well produce or maintain some information to which access is restricted, such as medical information for covered entities or education data for schools, student information for schools. If a device is hacked and this information is made available to the public, this could cause at least some embarrassment to the agency and possibly much worse. Another issue, of course, is records management. Even with cloud storage, the use of varied devices could encourage storage of records on the device itself, such as the C drive on a laptop, okay? And of course, this results in records management issues, such as version control, copy control. And there also tends to be a perception that the information on my personal device is mine rather than the agency's. And this could, again, well result in information being maintained or distributed inappropriately. Another issue is open records requests or e-discovery. When agencies are subject to open records laws, it's entirely possible that records maintained on individual devices could be subject to open records requests, FOIA requests, or e-discovery in the event of a lawsuit. This could mean weeding through everything on a device to find the relevant materials. And an employee or an official most likely does not want his or her device subject to the scrutiny that would come from these processes. Another issue is inappropriate devices. If the software on devices or if devices themselves are not up to date or aren't the most recent iteration, then the device may or may not be able to interface effectively or properly with other devices to enable a productive work environment. For example, I was at an event some years ago at which a participant's laptop did not have wireless connection software, so the participant was not able to fully enjoy all the benefits of this particular event. Another issue is personal use versus professional use. Personal devices can too easily become distractions, either at work or at home, if the employee is working off-site. Keeping some employees focused is difficult enough, and giving the person the tools to facilitate that distraction can very easily lead to decreased productivity. Multiply that, and the productivity of the agency could easily decrease. Another issue is lost devices or terminated employees. If an individual loses his or her device or is terminated or leaves an agency, the question of what to do with the information that may be on that device remains. The negative publicity from devices that are found to have restricted information on them is not something your agency wants to deal with. Here in Kentucky, we had some laptops that were lost by an agency, a public health agency some years ago, that had AIDS information on them. It's something you need to be careful of. Now, I had said on the previous slide that security risks may be decreased under BYOD. Well, on the other hand, they may be increased. Agencies have to be alert, to the possibility of data leaks or viruses. Unfortunately, employees may well not have this level of security, the level of security to protect against these things on their individual devices. While the everyday security software for home use can cover day-to-day activities, an agency might not trust it to protect valuable customer data. In addition, how do companies with BYOD stop employees who are leaving the agency from walking away with a significant amount of data available quickly and easily on their respective devices? Now, turn it around, this can also be a problem for employees. They may feel their own privacy is at risk if they do personal web surfing on a device that is linked to their agency's system. And finally, support is a possible problem under BYOD culture. While the cost for support has been moved from the agency to the user, the quality of support might not be high enough to ensure effective use of devices by agency officials and employees. Will tech support, for example, be able to address all the issues related to the devices in use at your agency? So those are some benefits and some issues you're likely to run into with BYOD. So what do you do about that? Now, there are several steps you can take. A first is what's called mobile device management or mobile application management. Mobile device management software allows an agency to distribute apps, data, settings, patches, those sorts of things for individual devices remotely, while also providing the opportunity to monitor device usage. Ideally, MDM software allows administrators to oversee mobile devices remotely as easily as they can desktop computers and provides optimal performance for users. MDM software can help an agency enforce policies and ensure workers are both productive and safe from malware. Additional functionality such as remote wiping can be helpful for addressing the risk posed by lost or stolen devices. Now, mobile device management is device specific. Mobile application management is more general, and as the name suggests, it gives agencies more control over the applications that are to be found on a user's device. Backup is always important. To alleviate some of the security risks I talked about earlier, remember to back up your information. Now, this is a standard emergency management step that all of you should be familiar with, and it can help you if your data is lost or if devices are hacked and information is hijacked. Keep in mind, of course, that backups are for emergency management only. This isn't a fix for day-to-day problems, and other steps should be in place to address those issues. Simple security fixes can be installed. Simple, generally inexpensive measures such as antivirus software on devices, passwords or other keys on devices, encryption. These sorts of things can go a long way toward protecting your agency's information. Having a policy in place. Excuse me. Agencies using BYOD should have a policy in place, and the rest of this list, training, acceptance, and consistency, all relates to policy. This should include not only a policy about how devices are to be used and monitored when doing agency business, but also the protection of agency employees' personal data and a termination policy to address what will happen when an individual leaves the agency. Excuse me. Now, training on your company policy is essential. Your BYOD policy will not be successful if you don't teach employees how they are or aren't allowed to use their own personal devices for business activity. For example, you need to train employees on what files they can and cannot access with their devices and why. If you don't provide comprehensive training and refresher courses for your employees, they will lose sight of rules and procedures, and a data breach is most likely to happen. Acceptance. Along with the development and implementation of your plan, you need to present the plan to each employee and get written proof of their acceptance. Excuse me. The plan is important to the preservation of agency's records and information, but you have to understand and make sure, excuse me, that each staff member, each employee understands and accepts the plan. And finally, the plan has to be applied consistently. It has to be applied across the board. If your agency's staff is expected to use their individual devices in a certain way, according to certain guidelines, or under certain monitoring conditions, then the agency head, your commissioner, your secretary, should be expected to use his or her device in that way according to those guidelines or under those conditions as well. Exceptions to policies for whomever are what allow for security breaches and other potentially business-crippling situations. Now, while BOD culture presents your agency with one way of using technology to conduct business, okay, and on the whole, it can be a positive development if you take the appropriate steps. Social media such as Twitter or Facebook present another. Like BYOD, social media presents agencies with numerous opportunities. Among those opportunities are reaching constituents. for example, through alerts, updates, education. Agencies can use Facebook or Twitter. I'll use Facebook or Twitter as examples because those are the ones I'm most familiar with. There are obviously a large number of other potential social media platforms. But agencies can use Facebook or Twitter to alert constituents to various matters such as road conditions or other emergencies, and to update them about those things. Further, social media can be a platform for educating citizens about what your agency does, including your responsibilities and the services you provide. Given the prevalence of social media, this is a fairly easy way to get the word out. Okay? Agencies can use social media for provision of services. You can use social media not only to get the word out about what you do, but also to do it. Examples of this include Amber Alerts or class registration. Law enforcement agencies responsible for criminal investigations or agencies responsible for public education could thus make use of social media to facilitate or accomplish their statutory obligations. Social media can be used for increased transparency. Agencies could make available on social media records that document what they do, allowing for more open and accountable government. For example, posting recordings of meetings, meeting agendas, or meeting minutes on a social media site for public access could make government more transparent to its citizenry. One thing to be careful of in relying on social media in this regard is for fulfilling open meeting requests. If your state has particularly strict open meetings laws, this might not fill the bill. Social media can help with increased efficiency. Given its widespread use, social media can be used by agencies to distribute notices quickly and at relatively low cost. Feedback and informal polling data can be obtained fairly quickly and easily. Generally, social media offers agencies opportunities to provide or obtain information at very little cost. And finally, social media can allow for increased collaboration among agencies. Social media provides a platform for the collaboration of agencies to the benefit, not only to their benefit, but ultimately to their constituents' benefit. For example, the state archives could use social media to help local agencies manage their records more effectively. This would not only be to the benefit of local agencies, but also to the benefit of citizens who can retain records and information more quickly. So social media has plenty of positive things to recommend it. What are some of the drawbacks? Well, among those are comments. For example, when comments are used to bully or used in a negative way. Yes, debate and discourse are essential, and good government requires public feedback, but unfortunately not all feedback is created equal. We've all read comments, right, that are irrelevant, inconsequential, or just plain rude. And by using social media, an agency opens itself up to those sorts of things. Another issue with social media is records management. It's very easy to lose sight of the general nature of the content that is posted on social media. Agencies do need to remember that these are public records and that they're created and maintained on these platforms, and as such, they need to be subjected to appropriate records management statutes and practices. Again, open records requests and e-discovery. Further, because these are public records, they could be subject to open records requests. Again, FOIA requests, e-discovery in the event of a lawsuit. Agencies should be very aware of how records posted to and created on social media are managed so that responses to open records requests, motions for discovery can be handled appropriately. Another issue is security. Social media accounts are hacked pretty regularly. And clearly, if the wrong information is posted to a social media account or if information is altered, an agency could run into quite a bit of trouble. Agencies should pay close attention to the information that is disseminated via those accounts so that any issues arising in this regard can be handled quickly. And finally, there's the work use versus personal use issue. It's easy for staff members to use the agency's social media accounts as an excuse to spend time on their own accounts, thereby costing the agency time and money. Further, staff may use social media inappropriately to air grievances about the agency. So agencies need to be aware of staff using social media during work time and make efforts to curtail or at least control that use. So benefits and drawbacks. Now what do we do? Well, several recommendations. Remember that these are public records. Okay, keep that in mind. One state's public records law defines a public record as documentary materials regardless of physical form or characteristics which are prepared, owned, used in the possession of, or retained by a public agency. That's Kentucky. This certainly includes social media content, meaning the information is subject to appropriate records management laws and regulations. Monitor comments closely, very closely, or turn them off. Also, in addition to remembering that these are public records, remember this is a public forum. We monitor public meetings and we conduct them according to certain rules, so why not conduct online exchanges under similar controls? If you're not comfortable turning off comments, which is fair, allow people their say, right? Monitor them closely for inappropriate language. If comments are not relevant to the discussion at hand, you may direct the person to someone who can help him or her. We do that on our Facebook site in Kentucky. If someone asks a business-related question that isn't related to the post at hand, we direct them to the person at the Department for Libraries and Archives who can help them. Another step, only post records that are maintained elsewhere. If what is posted is a copy of material that is somewhere else, that offline copy may be kept for records retention purposes and can be made available in the event of an open records request or a discovery order. If your agency does this, you're likely covered and don't need to maintain the online version of the information for the full life of the record. And finally, and again, similar to what I said with BYOD, have a policy in place and enforce it consistently. This is, again, very important to have this policy in place to control business-related social media usage by your agency. Policy should include general content guidelines, the responsibilities of employees and site administrators as they relate to your agency's social media use. So that's what I've got for BYOD and for social media usage. Another approach to managing electronic records are electronic records management systems, and Chris Stenson from the Oregon State Archives is going to talk to you about those.
All right, thank you, Jim. That's some excellent stuff. So, my name is Chris Stenson, as Jim said so kindly. I work for the Oregon State Archives. I am going to be talking about electronic records management systems, which is not a topic that I think is addressed all that often amongst the greater records management / archives community. I think it's growing in discussion. So why am I talking about this and why should you bother listening to me? Well, I spend a good deal of my time here at the Oregon State Archives administering just one such system. So while I do not present myself as an end-all be-all of knowledge about these things, I have some insight into what they are, why they're a useful tool, and why we should all consider using them. So without further preamble, I will advance the slide. There we go. Okay. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about why we even want to talk about this, and then I'm going to talk about what electronic records management systems really are. So first of all, we all have transitioned at some point or another over the last few decades from a mostly paper-based environment to a primarily or at least 50-50 electronic environment. I think we'd all, if we took a look at our general work processes and what we do, we probably do an ever-increasing percentage of it electronically. We still have paper, especially those of us that face the public. There's always going to be some level of that, and there's some antiquated processes that we're kind of stuck with for lack of other tools. But the reality is that we're doing more and more electronically. However, we are still attempting to manage those electronic records for retention, disposition, security, etc., in sort of paper-based processes, which don't always scale particularly well. So what I have in front of me here is sort of a sample file structure in a traditional sense. And you could picture this as folders in a file cabinet. You could picture this as folders on an electronic system of any type. But the idea is that this, in a traditional records management sense, would be you would have a main area, HR administration in this case. You'd have a variety of subheadings under which things would be filed. filed, and then you would have the actual documents items themselves. In this example, it's showing digital documents. You'll see there's some PDFs and things like that listed there. So the idea is here, this is what we've been trying to do by and large. So we've been trying to replicate our traditional filing structures in an electronic environment. And theoretically, that should work. Well, what tends to happen? Unfortunately, left to its natural end, we end up with something that looks like this, what we call a quote-unquote filing system. This would represent just about every shared drive that most of us have to some extent or another in our workplaces that I've ever seen. Basically, every place I've worked has something like this, save for the current one. What you see here is some of them replicate, functional categories much like the previous one. But you'll see there's also a lot of redundancy. So if we're looking over to the left there, we have some things that are pretty high level, other things that are much more specific. You can tell halfway through, you'll see a few things with people's names on there. Adam's lawsuit, Aaron's stuff. Those are not particularly useful monikers because they're the only ones that know what that stuff really is. So we've seen a real breakdown because in a system like this, you only know where to put something if you know where it already, if you know where things are. So we end up with a lot of, in a semi-managed environment like this, and I say semi-managed because IT often sets some broad rules, but if you get access to it, you can pretty much do what you want in most cases. And you see towards the end there, people have just given up and they've just started dumping documents at the top level because they have no idea where things go. And as a result, we've had a complete breakdown of organization, of filing structure. There's no way for us to actually take any action on this without it being manual. You have to review every document, so there's no way to apply effectively a retention period to any of this. There's no effective way to apply security to this except for at the very top level. So basically saying, if you can see this, you've got a certain level of security clearance. So there's some pretty serious issues, not to mention that this sort of mess will continue on because of all the little buried, siloed knowledge in there forever. So your IT department will be facing with an ever-growing pile of this stuff with no real prospect of getting rid of it. So this is the real problem with when we try to replicate a loose paper-based environment in an electronic system without something to help us mitigate that. So let's look a little bit topic to topic on how we deal with paper versus electronic. Now, there are some generalizations here. Of course, we can always find some conflicts. However, these are sort of generally true statements, I'd say. So first of all, in a paper world, who controls the records? I think traditionally we often had more gatekeepers. When you file documents, they'd go into a certain area. You'd have filing cabinets. You would have a records officer. You'd have a departmental head, whomever the person was who was in charge of managing that. Those documents would go to a central location, and they would be filed. This meant that you had certain people with much greater knowledge about the content, but that was okay because you had them filed in a certain area. They were the people you went to get access to the information and to manage it accordingly for disposition, etc. With electronic records, the real challenge is that we have no real way to do that anymore because all of us, to some extent or another, touch electronic records on a daily basis. We may not be the quote-unquote official custodian of those records, but we send emails back and forth constantly. We're generating records all the time that way. We have draft documents on our desktops. Maybe we're using a shared drive. Maybe we have some things on our personal drive. Maybe we have things elsewhere. So we're all touching things. So we can no longer rely on that sole gatekeeper, that expert that's going to file this stuff for us, which means we're now shifting the burden to everybody knowing a bunch of stuff about records management, which, as is shown in the previous slide with that kind of mess you saw there, is often not the case. So let's also look at how much is there. Well, there's plenty of paper. I know. I talk to agencies all the time when they're saying we're buried under paper. What can we do about this? So that's not an insignificant issue. However, when you look at the actual sheer numbers, paper pales in comparison to electronic content. We're limited to the space at hand with paper. We actually have to make painful decisions like, using our office space or renting space for storage for paper records. And so you tend to make decisions about how much you're going to keep, and it keeps the amount of it to a more realistic level compared to electronic. I'm a little glib here, but with electronic records, we have what I would say infinite invisible piles known to nobody but IT. We all create tons of this stuff, and a lot of it isn't actually record, quote-unquote, material, depending on your state's definition of that. A lot of it is transitory materials, a short-term value, redundant, lots and lots and lots of duplicates, reference files, stuff that belongs to somebody else, but you're using a copy of it, all that sort of stuff. And the problem is, because we lack a physical reminder, this stuff isn't physically shoving us out of our workspace. It's not in giant piles in the hallways we walk in. It's all in these neat little folders that we never have to look at. IT folks are really the only ones that see the actual volume in play there. And, you know, the general consensus among other people is that they don't see it, it's not a concern for them. So we have way more stuff to deal with, which even further underscores the thing that you can't really do manual records management on this very effectively. How do we dispose of stuff? So when it comes time to do a records destruction, whether these are records that have reached their full retention or whether these are non-record materials that just simply need to be purged on a regular basis to keep the business flowing, how do we dispose of the copies? Well, in paper, generally speaking, we're going to have an official file somewhere in a file cabinet. We pull that one from the cabinet and destroy. Maybe there's a couple redundant files that are documented. We destroy those as well. And then we also hope there's a bunch more, there aren't a bunch more floating around. Naturally, it's always difficult to get total control, but people tend to limit the amount they can store because you might want to have reference copies, but you only have one little half-size file cabinet, so it's not like you're going to be keeping backups of everything. So generally speaking, you can control your content in a fairly straightforward manner with this. However, in the electronic realm, following up on the previous point, we have our official copy. We then, of course, have copies in personal drives. In emails, think about when you're editing a document, how many times you send that back and forth to, what, a dozen people, 20 people, who knows? Every single one of those copies is now floating around, and every single person that was on that list has a copy of it. Every time HR sends out a policy announcement to the whole agency, how many people is that? 50, 100, 300? We have 1,000-person agencies, and they get every single one of them gets those general emails. So you have massive amounts of redundancies. Thumb drives, so people are traveling around with things, taking them off-site, copies of things, and there's legitimate reasons to do so, but we don't control that, so we have no way of effectively destroying it. Burn disks, backup tapes, similarly, so we have tons and tons of this content. And if you're doing an official records purge or destruction, you're probably hitting the official copy and not a lot else. So we're not really ever getting rid of anything. And as a result, we open our agencies up to liability for lawsuits. Certainly e-discovery issues crop up. Public records requests, because of course if it's there and it's not otherwise restricted, we have to turn it over, regardless of whether or not we thought we had destroyed it. So this can create a lot of big hassles, not just from a practical standpoint, day-to-day business, but from a legal liability and ongoing operations side as well. So the next question is, do we even want to get rid of it? See, this is part of it as well. There's a bit of a motivation factor here. So in paper, yeah, again, that physical reminder thing. If I've got a stack of papers a mile high on my desk, it's going to be staring me at the face every time I walk into work telling me to do something with it. And if I'm one of those people that's more comfortable with that than others, and there are certainly those people, your boss probably isn't one of those people, and they're going to get on you about that. So ultimately, there's something there to remind you. To get this stuff to take care of. So yes, you are motivated to dispose of things you shouldn't have anymore. However, electronically, same thing. The old mantra, storage is cheap. Well, it is. It's getting ever cheaper. However, it's certainly not free, and it's not so much the storage space itself. You know, you or I can go buy a 3-terabyte drive for $100 these days. But it's the management of that information. If you can't control the content, if you don't know what you have, all the storage in the world is not going to help you. So in this case, though, there's a common conception, certainly among your average employee that doesn't deal with records as part of their main job. They don't have to look at it. They don't have to see it. Those neat little file folders are there. They dump stuff in there. It goes away somewhere into the magical land of electronic records, and they don't have to think about it again. So there's a bit of a motivation challenge. So this is when we talk about trying to tackle these problems through training alone. It can work, but it's very difficult to ensure compliance, particularly over a large area. More questions that come up with this. Can we find the records when we need them? So all those problems I mentioned before get compounded here. So we have too much stuff, and it's generally poorly organized. So it's very, very difficult to find it. Public records requests then get more and more expensive, and they take time. So maybe you're not in a situation where you're paying somebody to necessarily search for this stuff. Or are you really? Because there are a number of studies out there, and you can find numbers all over the place. However, the average employee spends a great deal of their time looking for information. Think, every single one of you, think about the sort of tasks you do on a daily basis and how much of your time is actually spent just finding the information you need to respond to a request, to do a task, etc. So organization ahead of time is a time saver, and it is very much a money saver down the line. So, and when you have to then retrieve this on a time frame, depending on how your public records law is set up in your state, sometimes you have a very short deadline. Sometimes you at least have to respond. Sometimes you have the right to charge people for it. Sometimes you don't. But nonetheless, this can get very, very messy and very expensive. Let's talk about security for a second. It's rarely people's first thought, at least unless you're on the IT security side or the information governance side. But security is a big concern because if we don't have a full inventory of our stuff, if we have all those redundant copies, it's nearly impossible to actually control them effectively, which opens up the risk of things being inappropriately disclosed all the time. And I think we can all think of many examples at all levels of government and non-government alike of situations like this happening. How do we maintain access over time? So this is sort of a longer-term concern, but it is not an insignificant one. As we know, the technological obsolescence cycle is quite quick. Things change fast. And so if we don't have a good handle on our stuff, a lot of stuff is going to fall behind, and it's going to get hopelessly obsolete. So we have software that gets old, hardware, file formats, and virtually anything else related to it that gets old and over time has to be either what we call refreshed or migrated. So things need to be moved forward to newer formats. And again, we need inventories and migration plans for these things, and that's a very difficult thing to do, again, if you don't have a firm handle of all of your stuff. So now to the meat of it. So all of that preamble, the dire statements about the place we're in, I'm here now going to talk about there is something we can use, a tool that can help us manage this. Now, this is a very broad and generic description for an electronic records management system. So for those of you that may be more of an expert in this area or have dealt with IT systems more, please don't call me out on my imprecise definition. This is for the layman. So in short, an electronic records management system is a software application, a database as well as a document storage system that allows you to manage all of your content in one place. It can handle records that are created and received electronically, so your born digital content, and it can also handle records that you got in hard copy and maybe scanned in. Many of these systems can also allow you to track your physical inventory all in the same place. So when you go to do a search for certain types of records for, say, destruction, it'll bring up a list of not only the electronic ones, but markers for all of the physical ones, so you can take care of it all at once. So the real key here is that it's all in one place. It allows you to not look at all those different silos. It allows you to control your content. And this can help you manage access, maintenance, destruction. I didn't write security there, but that's part of it as well. So there's a lot of things that go into a system like this. So benefits of this. So a lot of the downfalls I saw of the manual, or that I listed on the manual side, you see benefits with using an electronic records management system, or I'm going to refer to them as ERMSs from now on, since it's a little less wordy. So government efficiency. Certainly, none of us have overwhelming budgets, and certainly we are always being asked to do more with less. So anything we can do to make ourselves more efficient is going to be beneficial for us. So paper and electronic information can be managed together. I mentioned that. You see dramatic improvements in response time for public records and discovery requests. And that in turn leads to a happier public, which theoretically could lead to better funding or at least greater public support for your initiatives in the future. This is a very real thing. We do respond to the public. The public, at some point or another, controls how we operate. So it's important to be transparent about these things, but do anything we can to make them happy with our work. So in this case, we do see, and I have examples from our own system, in the terms of that retrieval time for hundreds of thousands of records or very precise requests. It's amazing how much faster it is from what it once was. We see, of course, server space reduction, so less unnecessary redundancy. And when you think about, just to give a conservative example, if you had 25 copies of every email in your system, which is probably not terribly realistic because there's a lot more than that in some cases, but say 25 copies, if you cut that down to 1 or 2 official copies of just the ones you essentially need, not including system backups, that's right there is a 25-fold reduction in storage space. And again, while it's not free or it's not expensive per se, that's a big change, and that can really free up resources for other things. So that is a significant advantage there. Other things, transparency and accountability. Again, going along with public trust, information is easy to locate and find, therefore there's less question about whether it's being handled appropriately. Rules, that would be security rules, access rules, management rules, destruction rules, are consistently applied to all information at the same time. You don't have things willy-nilly. Everything that goes in the system gets managed. Security classifications control access. So not only like in a shared drive can I say, well, everybody can access this area, but I can lock things down all the way to the document level. I can start with saying everybody in the agency can see this top level. And then as we drill down, we can lock that down further and further to be really small subsets of people. And it's very controllable that way, very flexible. And this is certainly true of the system I use. It's true of most of these sort of systems if implemented properly. Audit trails of all actions taken. Certainly, we have run across a lot of situations where we're concerned about who did what, and do we have accountability for that? Can we pin responsibility for certain actions? Well, systems like this allow you to track everything. The system I operate, it records audit trails of every single action any user takes. So there's no way of sneaking around. If someone does something that you think they shouldn't have done, there's evidence of that. So there's a lot of benefit to that, and certainly that helps with public transparency and accountability. And in general, information created is systematically and routinely managed and maintained. So by systematically and routinely, I mean it just becomes a routine. It happens in the background. We don't think about it. And as a result, we face a lot less situations where inconsistent rules are applied, where you're doing your best, but frankly, you missed that batch, and somebody made a different decision with this other batch. And when that gets to the public eye, they look at that and go, well, it looks like you're doing things maliciously, if they want to think that, or incompetently at best. So if you can do things consistently and it's always the same decision, it is much easier to defend your actions. Okay, so those are some of the benefits of these systems. And I'm not going to get really into the hardcore IT side of that because that's a whole other discussion. However, I want to talk a little bit about the process any agency who's thinking about this sort of software might want to go through. Well, first of all, let's talk about preparing for selecting one of these things. First of all, know your state laws, rules, and requirements. That's not only your records management laws and requirements, but maybe your procurement rules, of course, budgeting, all these different things. That's the first step. I probably don't have to tell all you that, but it is important because there are subtle differences state to state. You may also have requirements in your state rules about what sort of systems you are allowed to keep records in. Maybe you have to keep physical copies of certain, let's say, permanent records, things like that. It varies greatly from state to state, so always check with your state authorities first before making any decisions. Which I just get to. Talk to your state records management authorities. Often this is within the state archives, but that's not universal by any means. I think it's probably about half the states are that way. Others, records management exists within another business entity. Sometimes they have authority over local government entities, and sometimes they do not. So you want to investigate who has authority over that and double check on that. Sometimes local agencies are a little looser than others, so depending on how your government framework is set up. Understand your needs and goals. I think that goes for any new project you're embarking on. But if you don't have a clear understanding of what you're trying to do, so what problems are you trying to solve with this? What are your goals for the end of this? You're going to end up with too broad of a field, and you're going to have trouble making a decision. Or you might end up with a product that's wrong. You might end up with a solution that's really not what you need. So understand your needs and goals internally before you go that far. Also, then tally your internal resources. So let's look realistically. We all have the pie in the sky. I think we could all point to the quote-unquote perfect solution, but those are not always realistic for the entity we work for, and that's something we have to work within those constraints. So let's look at our budget. Look at our budget process, and perhaps there's a thing of where can we save money on this, or what will this replace? Don't forget that this is not necessarily a new outlay. This can directly benefit you in other areas, so it's not just an outlay of cash. Sometimes you get something back elsewhere. Look at the internal expertise that you might have. So do you have folks inside your agency that would be well suited to this sort of thing? Do you have IT support that does good application support? Do you have the ability to program if necessary? Do you have internal records management support? All those sort of things. Tally up who you have available. IT, that sort of goes along with that. What do you have in terms of IT resources? Do you outsource a lot of things? That would play a factor. Do you have an in-house shop that mostly just keeps things running, or do they do more development? Again, you'll see wide variance place to place, and you have to take that into consideration, so there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And of course, the time available. What's your time frame for implementing something like this, and how much time can you realistically dedicate to it on a daily or weekly basis? Because that also could lead into your decisions on what sort of solution might work for you, because there are lots of different flavors of these things, some of which are much more labor heavy and some of which are much more service heavy on the external side. So it's all that sort of trade-off, money versus personnel sort of thing. So you really have to have a clear understanding of what you have before you go out for an RFP or whatever the case may be. So next thing, when we get to that point, one second here. Apologies. Okay, so when we get to the point where we're actually talking to vendors, how do we make that decision? I think this is a tricky one because people come to different decisions from different areas. So first of all, I tell you to talk to your colleagues in community. So you have other government entities that are similar to yourself. There are others within your field. Maybe you're a member of statewide or national groups that talk about this stuff. So talk to them and find out what they may have experienced, what they've heard about, what they feel is useful. Because again, many of these products are objectively quote unquote good, but they may not always be ideal for your scenario. I do always caution, look very closely, because an electronic records management system, ERMS, is not the same thing as an electronic document management system, an EDMS. Many times what people think are records management systems are in fact just document management. And I'm not going to get into all the nuances, but the short answer is document management does not handle retention and often does not have some of the more advanced management features down the road. It's designed for collaboration. It's designed for access and use right now, but it does not always think down the road. So that's very important because sometimes people get drawn into this because the document management system is a lot cheaper, at least initially. Sometimes there's a records management module that people forget to purchase. So it's very important to know that distinction and not get confused and not assume they're the same thing. Match the product to your scale. So again, I've mentioned this a couple times, but the best product might overwhelm your office. If you try to implement some massive enterprise scale software and you simply don't have the expertise in-house to implement it, it's going to be a massive outlay of cash and you're not going to get a lot of benefit out of it. So be aware of what your scale is and what your needs are. When it comes to talking to vendors, be very clear about the ownership of the data and interoperability and portability of that data. Make sure you have exit clauses, aka you have the right to get your stuff out, and very explicitly stated what you own. And this goes doubly so if you're going with some sort of facilitated solution where maybe this is going to the cloud, maybe you're doing a software as a service sort of thing, which is getting ever more popular because it cuts down on all the infrastructure. But it's very important that you are clear about that because you may have laws that prevent you from doing certain things, or at the very least, you need to make sure that you own the data and there's no question about you getting it back. I mentioned this, so on-site or a hosted solution, there's valid arguments for both. Sometimes if you are a larger agency and have good IT resources, an on-site may be the best option because you can totally customize it the way you want. But I think for most of us, it's not terribly realistic anymore in some cases because we don't have those resources anymore or we can't be guaranteed they will last. And so a hosted solution to some extent or another may be the way to go. And think about the training and support plan. Does the vendor include that? Are you on your own? Do you have to hire consultants to handle that part? Are you going to have to be your own experts? All of these kind of go into what do you have the ability to do? And I think that's probably going to factor in to the cost as well. But I always encourage you to look in things that are not going to cost you a lot extra for that thing. Can you get it baked in? Certainly it's worth a discussion. Okay, so when we actually get to the point, we've got our ERMS selected. We have purchased it with the vendor. Great. How are we going to do this implementation? And I'd be happy to talk to folks about this sort of process since we've worked a lot with that here in a separate time. But so basically general things, do's and don'ts here. So do communicate clear goals to all participants. And what I mean by that is that not just the administration and the IT, but the users that are going to be faced with this. I think you will see, some initial fear and hostility even sometimes amongst folks when facing a new system. But if you communicate effectively ahead of time to let them know why you're doing this, what it's going to do for them, I think you will see some of that erode because you will have people that are more understanding of what it is. Nothing is a panacea, but that helps. Do focus on change management. This is the second part of that. It's very important. I think the hardest part of any rollout of a new system is not the software itself. It's the preparing people for the change, talking to them about it, getting them to embrace the change. And that is its own science as well. But it's something you cannot neglect. And in fact, I encourage spending more resources on that than on other areas. Start with a pilot group that's eager to go. Don't try an agency-wide implementation on day one, and certainly don't start with your most recalcitrant group of employees. Start with a group that has a clear benefit to be gained. They've got old, inefficient processes they can't wait to jettison. Start with those folks because they will have the enthusiasm to jump in and learn the new stuff, and they will then turn into your most vocal internal advocates when it comes time to expand. So certainly, in agencies I've worked with on ours, the folks that have done so well are the ones that have done this approach. And do pick a coherent batch of first records for best success. And what I mean by this is that don't just say we're going to throw it all in on day one. Start with a distinct area that makes sense. Project files, contracts, HR documentation, whatever you want to start with, but areas that can be clearly defined, and you start there because you'll learn as you go along what works best, and this will give you the ability for the users to not be both learning the new system and trying to figure out how to make RM decisions, records management decisions, all at the same time. Take the records management decision-making process out of this here and let them learn the software first, and then go to your more complicated stuff that has some nuance and all that sort of stuff. I think you'll find much better success with that. A couple do nots. Do not try to hit everything at once. Again, I sort of mentioned this before, but a focused, limited implementation initially is definitely the way to go versus a widespread, shallow implementation, one person from every department, because they're going to sit there on little islands and they're going to struggle. Do not try to tackle your backlog first. Do a date forward approach to get the ball rolling. So that's not to say a backfile project is never appropriate, but in general, what we find is that if you start by saying, I have this massive pile of old stuff and we got to get through that, well, that can take time. And it will probably take a long time. It's often very complicated because you have to parse it out. It wasn't always organized. And meanwhile, because you haven't implemented date forward, all your new stuff is still getting dumped onto this pile. So it just keeps growing. And it's a morale killer too, because they see this mountain and they're like, we're going to be at this for months. No. Start date forward with your new stuff and say, as of right now, we're going to be doing everything this way. And then gradually whittle away at that pile when you have time on a project basis, whatever you need. And again, you'll find people adopting it, and you won't be contributing to the old problem. That old stuff's not going anywhere, but at least you're not adding to it at that point. Okay, so one last little bit here on tips and tricks for best effect of an ERMS from best benefit. Because basically, once you've purchased it, you might as well get your money's worth. So this is a chance for you to scrutinize and revamp your old procedures. Don't just replicate the processes you have. We saw that in that first couple slides I showed you with the old file plan that we replicate across. Where can you combine things for greater efficiency? Where can you reduce the total number of categories you've asked people to sort into? Where can you find new procedures, cut out a lot of steps? Because I think what we find when we start looking at these steps is in many cases there are a lot of work processes that have a bunch of steps that only exist because they had to once upon a time given the limitations of the technology you were using. Paper-based steps, handoffs to multiple people. These sort of systems particularly can make reviews much easier because the documents exist in one place. You just have to give permissions to people to see them. You don't have to send copies around. So a lot of these steps can be removed. We've certainly done that in our own agency here and have seen dramatic decreased number of steps in various jobs. So don't just replicate old inefficiencies. Look at this as a blank slate. What else can you do? Fix the issues you have at the beginning. So what I mean by this is little things will crop up. You can expect little issues, but plan for your future needs with this. So don't just build this with next week in mind. Build this with next year or the year after in mind. So you are building for a bigger state, scalable sort of implementation. And I bled into my next one here, of course. So start small but aim big. And so don't just think of this as a one department thing. Think about, well, what are we going to do with the next one? Because as you're constructing how you're going to use this system, you're going to want to accommodate that so you don't paint yourself into a corner by just focusing on one area alone. Be ready to adjust. There will be hiccups. There will be things that don't work out as well as you thought. You may have to shift gears. You may have to focus in a different area. We do it all the time here, and you just have to go with it. So don't expect it to be perfect on day one, and don't get discouraged when that happens. Again, you go in here realistically and positively, but with a sense that you'll be adjustable if need be. And especially brag about your successes. I think by and large, people are embarrassed to talk about what they've done well, and they want to focus on all the challenges they have in government. And it can be tough. We take a lot of abuse from people. People love to bag on our efficiency or on how competent we are at our jobs. But you know what? When we do something well like this, when we're taking proactive steps, brag about it. Highlight it in your newsletter. Let people know the work you're doing to make sure you're preserving public records efficiently going forward. I don't know if that's necessarily going to change the world with people's opinions, but I think we all deserve a little bit of credit for taking proactive steps, because this isn't always easy. But that is, I think, my biggest takeaway is be proud of yourself when you do something good like this. So that's all I've got. We came in right on the dot here, but we do have time. We'll stick around for questions as long as people may have them. Becky, you want to give the intro on that?
Right. If anybody, sorry, can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
If you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat box, or if you want to talk and ask your question verbally, just raise your hand and we will unmute you. Or if you see a Q&A box, feel free to put a question in there as well.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, we do try to overwhelm people with our information, then they don't harass us too much. And just for a plug here, I would say that if you have questions that crop up later, you can send them to siri@statearchivists.org. Did I say that right, Rebecca?
Yep, that's correct. I
Great,
will
yes.
add that into the chat box too.
Excellent. Yeah. So if you think of questions later, as people often do, you can route them through there, and we can certainly help you with that.
And a question did come in.
I'm seeing that.
We have been using Vimeo to showcase videos from some of our building projects. What are the best ways to preserve and store those videos?
So that's a very specific question. So I can give you some generic sort of statement. I don't know exactly how Vimeo operates. By and large, with any of these sort of things, is I always like to make sure you get a quote-unquote offline copy. You want to avoid things that are locked up in a system like that, in the system it's generated within, or in the system, or in this case, a forum you're sharing things with. So if you have a possibility of downloading and preserving that, because just like with Facebook or YouTube or whatever else, once it's up there, you don't control necessarily always how long it's out there. Jim, you have anything additional to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you got it. Just avoid, try to make the file, speaking fairly specifically of file formats, try to make them as general as possible. Avoid proprietary file formats. That way, when you change systems, as Chris was saying, when you change systems, you'll be able to migrate this information much more easily, and it'll be much more accessible to you.
Yeah, and that's very much the case. So stick with the Library of Congress has a good list of different file formats that they utilize, and that's not a bad place to start. You might also check with your state authorities if there's a required list. Some states, like here in Oregon, we do have a required list for certain types of media, but usually sticking with MPEG type encodings, avoid the ones that are locked up in one software or another. For sure. And once you have custody of the videos, then frankly, then you monitor them the same way you would the rest, so ideally within a controlled system. If not, though, you have to just keep an eye on that, on your formats, to make sure you're always keeping ahead of the game. Things don't disappear overnight, so while formats change rapidly, support for them doesn't disappear right away, and you do have to, you can plan for that a little bit.
Do have a couple more questions in the chat box.
Okay. In the chat box? Okay.
Yep.
Do I have, let's see here. So.
Is there case law regarding records on both mobile devices and stored elsewhere? In some cases, it seems that the court will want you to preserve both instances, not just one. That's a great question. I don't know enough to be able to answer it right now, but I know people who would know. Richard, if you want to email me offline, I'll be happy to respond. You can get me at Jim. I'll put it in the box. You can email me here. I can get with you on that.
Okay, and I've got a question from Tammy Woodward here. Do you have a list of government-friendly electronic records management system vendors? Well, I can give you a limited list of, certainly we can provide a limited list of things that exist. That is not an endorsement for said systems. Government-friendly is kind of a loaded term. Generally here in the United States, certainly here in Oregon, Department of Defense, so DOD 5015.2, which is a electronic record keeping system standard created by the Department of Defense, is largely what most places go to in this country. There are other standards for these systems that are used internationally, and those are good too. But you may have requirements in your state for one or the other. But we can certainly, there are a limited number of those sort of systems, but there's still a few. There's a dozen or more at any given time. So a lot of it, I think the real question you might have to ask is, the real question you have to ask is, what's your scale of need? Because, of course, there are very large products from the likes of IBM and HP and some of those that can be a little overwhelming for a small implementation. And there are other smaller companies that may be a better choice, but I can't specifically speak to their reliability. And then I think the other part of this would be making sure you're looking at whether or not this is a managed solution. So are they storing it for you? Are they implementing sort of software as a service? Are they using the cloud? And double checking on that. Some companies have multiple product lines, but I'll see if I can't put together sort of a rough list of just what's out there, and you can go from there. And maybe I can get that sent out to the attendee list or something. And it looks like Lori Tomlin had a similar sort of thing. Yes, we'll make the slides available. There will be a recording of this available after the fact. And that list I mentioned, we'll get you all the information we can. Great. Well, I was really pleased with the attendance today. I think if we don't have any more questions, it's about time. Okay, one last plug. Today's Electronic Records Day. Probably should have led with that. So this is a day we like to talk about electronic records and all the challenges we face and the work we're doing with our stakeholder communities, with outside groups, with the public, whomever you got. Twitter has a hashtag EREXDay that you can check out and join in the conversation. We got folks all over the country and some international ones as well participating with that. So by all means, check that out, and thanks for coming.